This is not a battlefield recap. This is the dark truth behind a private story. How power controlled what could be said and who paid. Some stories from World War II were recorded in speeches, others were recorded in silence, and later described as private. A quiet letter, a careful photograph, a smile on film. And then, after the war, those fragments become evidence of who someone really was. But fragments can lie, not because the ink is false, but because the frame is controlled. The official story says Eva Braun was simply a girlfriend, a young woman, romantic, sheltered, apolitical, sealed away from the machinery of the regime. But inside systems built on power, silence is not empty space. Silence is often a function, a protection, a permission, a method. Because in certain rooms, not speaking becomes a kind of participation, and that changes how we read every surviving page. This is the dark truth about Eva Braun's letters. Not the romantic version, not the private love story version, but the version hidden inside what she never said publicly. Not what the letters reveal, but what they carefully leave out. Because what's missing can tell you what a room was trained to avoid. If you value calm, long-form World War II stories that go deeper than headlines, you can like the video and subscribe to WW2 Diaries. Now, back to the story. Most retellings offer a clean division: Hitler in public, politics, war, ideology; Eva in private, romance, leisure, a woman's life. It's a comforting split. It allows viewers to say, she was separate. She didn't know. She was just a private person. And that story doesn't just soften her, it softens the entire inner circle, because it implies a protected bubble existed inside the system. But what if the bubble wasn't innocence? What if it was design? Because the private world around power is never neutral. It's where image is manufactured, where reputations are protected, where loyalty is tested without being named, and where the public is kept outside on purpose. Here's the first thing serious researchers run into. The correspondence record is thin, not a complete chain, not a simple archive box you can open and read start to finish. It's fragments, gaps, competing claims, missing years. And whenever you see missing years, you have to ask a hard question. Did the record vanish by chance? Or did the system, during life and after death, shape what survived? Because when the archive is incomplete, myth moves in like fog. And fog is useful. Fog turns responsibility into maybe. Fog turns proximity into complicated. Most accounts describe this as romance kept away from politics. That's the clean version. But it wasn't only about romance, it was about image dash dash. And who was allowed to be seen as human in the middle of mass death? A smiling woman on a terrace, a relaxed leader in a mountain home, a private laugh on film. Those images don't erase crimes, but they can blur the moral edges. And blur is a form of power. And once you see it that way, the letters stop being innocent documents. Silence was part of the decision. To understand what the silence was doing, we have to follow power where it lives, in rooms, in paper, and in pressure. When people say Eva Braun's letters, they imagine love notes. But in practice, these letters were created inside a controlled world. A world that trained people in what was safe to name and what was safer to leave blank. This isn't about guessing every thought inside her mind. It's about understanding the environment around her pen, because the most important part wasn't the wording, it was what the wording protected. And protection is never evenly distributed in systems like this. Someone is always protected more. Someone always pays. Start with the room where the pipeline begins, a photography studio, trusted access, a circle where private is not an accident. It's a gate. You don't enter this world by being random. You enter by being acceptable, safe, discreet. And discreet doesn't mean innocent. It means manageable. At first, paper seems harmless. Short notes, postcards, a casual rhythm. But paper creates a record, and records create risk. So even early on, the system encourages the same habit. Say what is safe. Avoid what threatens the room. In controlled circles, the first censorship is internal. No one has to shout. No one has to threaten. People simply learn what keeps them inside. The pressure here is proximity, Not battlefield fear, social fear. How close are you allowed to stand? How much are you allowed to know? How much are you allowed to ask? Power doesn't always demand silence. Power rewards it, and reward is a stronger leash than force. Silence was part of the decision. Now the setting shifts to the Berghof, the mountain residence where private life becomes stage. In the room, leisure, comfort, meals, jokes, holidays. A world that appears ordinary, missing from the room, the occupied cities, the deportations, the camps, the victims. Not because those realities didn't exist, because they were kept out of frame. What isn't shown is part of what's being sold. Here, letters are not the only record. There are albums, captions, private films, home movie style, where Hitler appears relaxed and domestic. It's not a war council. It's not a rally. It's a softness reel, and softness has a purpose. It creates an alternative memory. Because the private image doesn't deny the crimes, it distracts from them. The pressure here is reputation. A leader must appear disciplined, human, controlled. And the easiest way to maintain control is to keep the record gentle. No politics in the album, no victims in the film, no moral language in the room. A private world can become a shelter, then later an excuse. Look at who the letters are written to. A sister, a friend, a small circle. That sounds intimate, but intimacy doesn't guarantee honesty. Because in closed systems, even family communication can be strategic. Not in a conspiratorial way, but in a survival way. Private writing is not always private truth. Sometimes it's private safety. Now read the silence, not as romance, but as pattern. What rarely appears? The victims, the machinery, the moral reckoning, the clear recognition of what the regime was doing. Even if someone claims they didn't know details, they still know what topics the room never names. When something never appears, it can mean more than ignorance. It can mean, this subject is forbidden. This subject is dangerous. This subject would force responsibility into the room. The pressure is belonging. Inside the inner circle, the worst crime isn't confusion, it's disruption. You don't turn a pleasant terrace into a moral courtroom. You don't turn a private evening into a question about guilt. Because once the room becomes moral, someone becomes responsible. And responsibility is the one thing closed systems cannot tolerate in daylight. Now shift to Berlin, late April 1945. The room is no longer a terrace. It's corridors, concrete, a shrinking world. Power is collapsing, and collapsing power doesn't become honest. It becomes protective. The end of power is when it becomes most deliberate about memory. In the final days, paper becomes urgent. A final letter, a marriage record, a testament. These are not romantic gestures in the normal sense. They are legacy moves, a way to define what the world is allowed to remember and in what order. This is not romance. This is closure management. The pressure is reputation. Who will be seen as devoted? Who will be seen as responsible? Who will be seen as just private? When survival is gone, people fight for meaning. Silence was part of the decision. By the time the world finally learned her name, the consequences were already permanent, and the record was already damaged, because naming the cost would have changed who looked responsible. The cost wasn't a single moment, it was a slow distortion. A private image of Hitler as human could live beside the evidence of what his system did. And because the image felt domestic, people treated it as separate. Quiet cost can still be lethal. Because the mind likes a softer story, it likes a version that feels less frightening. So the image begins to do work. Not, he didn't do it, but he had another side. Not, it wasn't real, but it was complicated. And once that language enters memory, it spreads. After the war, a pattern appears in post-war descriptions. People close to the inner circle emphasize distance from decisions. They emphasize personal life. They emphasize confusion. In interrogations, memoirs, and later retellings, private becomes a shield. Not always by lying, often by framing. Framing doesn't need to deny crimes. It only needs to redirect attention. Numbers matter, but numbers can numb the mind. So hold one image and don't let it move. A neat letter, ordinary paper, careful handwriting. Now set it beside another reality. A Europe where ordinary life collapsed, where families were uprooted, imprisoned, murdered, erased. The distance between those two images is the cost. Not only the cost of war, but the cost of silence inside the system. Because silence allowed the room to remain comfortable, while the world outside became unlivable for millions. That is what Private protected. By now you might ask, why isn't there grief on the page for the victims? Why isn't there distance from the machine? Why isn't there visible revulsion? Because silence is not neutral inside a system like this. The most important part of these letters is what never appears publicly, a recognition that would force responsibility into the room. The circle lived inside an assumption: protect the leader, protect the image, keep the cost unnamed. And once that assumption becomes normal, the cost becomes routine. Silence was part of the decision. Afterward, the official story hardened, not because it was truer, but because it was useful. And usefulness is often the enemy of clarity. There is a moment, late April 1945, when the private world turns into official record. A marriage, a legal document, a political testament. In one sense, it is almost absurd, a collapsing regime making paperwork as the end approaches. But in another sense, it is perfectly logical. Because paperwork isn't only administration, it's narrative. Paper is how systems try to outlive themselves. After 1945, memory becomes a battleground. Memoirs soften edges. Language becomes careful. Responsibility becomes complicated. Complexity can be honest. It can also be a hiding place. Ask one question: who walked away with their story intact, and who carried the damage? Because the people with photographs, letters, and private artifacts often kept the most powerful tool of all, the ability to be seen as human. While the victims, many with no surviving documents at all, were reduced to statistics in the public imagination. That imbalance is part of the cost. Now widen the lens. The private Hitler image didn't come from nowhere. It was cultivated. Photography wasn't only documentation, it was enterprise. A business, a pipeline. Intimacy can be turned into propaganda, then turned into commerce, then turned into post-war myth. And when money and reputation are involved, the past rarely stays clean. After the war, reputations mattered. Families mattered. Associations mattered. Who you knew mattered. In denazification processes, testimony often becomes careful. Not necessarily false, but shaped. People describe themselves in survivable terms. I was only a worker. I was only near the circle. I was only private. I didn't know. Sometimes the most revealing evidence is not what is said, but how consistently the same phrases appear. Now step into the deeper discomfort. Inner circle diaries and notes show what the room treated as normal. Not normal in the moral sense, normal in the daily sense. Meals, visits, plans, small irritations, small loyalties. And that's what systems do best. They normalize themselves. Evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it schedules itself. Now add context. Hitler's public image was carefully curated. He was presented as disciplined, austere, married to the nation, not to a woman. Eva Braun's existence conflicted with the image. So her presence was managed, kept private, kept controlled, kept quiet. Not because romance was irrelevant, but because image was everything. If a regime lives on image, then private life becomes a political tool. Then comes the post-war memoir wave. Secretaries, adjutants, doctors, architects, people who stood near power and later tried to narrate it. In many memoirs, language becomes soft, not because the authors deny what happened, but because softness creates emotional distance. It was complicated. He had another side. She was apolitical. She didn't know. Soft language doesn't remove responsibility. It just makes it harder to feel. Now we reach the danger zone. When the archive is incomplete, people become hungry. They want a secret diary, a hidden confession, a private key that explains everything. And when people are hungry, someone will sell them food, even if it's fake. Disputed diary fragments, sensational new discoveries, documents with weak provenance. Misinformation doesn't need to be believable to spread. It only needs to feel satisfying. And then there is the market. Letters survive because someone kept them. Items survive because someone valued them. Photos survive because they were collected. Sometimes survival is accidental. Sometimes it is intentional. Sometimes it is profitable. Fragments become the story not because they are the whole truth, but because they are what remains. What survives is not always what mattered most. Sometimes it's what was easiest to keep or easiest to sell. This is the dark truth about Eva Braun's letters. What looks like private romance was also controlled silence. And the cost fell on the victims, the historical record, and the public's understanding of responsibility. Systems protect themselves first, often in the name of privacy, romance, and normal life. And when they do, the cost moves downward. Not everyone is allowed to be remembered as human. That privilege is distributed by power. Silence was part of the decision. This is not a story about condemning people from a distance. It's a story about how power behaves under pressure and how easily the human cost becomes a blank space. The dark truth about Eva Braun's letters is that they didn't just record a relationship, they recorded what a system trained people not to say and what that silence made possible afterward. And the question that remains is not only, what did she know? It is, what did the room require her not to name for the room to stay intact? But there is one more layer to this story, a layer that doesn't live in romance at all. It lives in the afterlife of paper. Because in the decades after 1945, the war didn't only end in courts and headlines. It ended in filing cabinets, in museum boxes, in private collections, in carefully chosen photographs, in missing letters, in testimonies that all sounded strangely similar. And when you trace what survived, you start to see what the silence was designed to do. Not in a single moment, but across years, across retellings, and across generations. When people think of evidence, they imagine something solid, a document, a signature, a date, a stamp. But in stories like this, evidence isn't only what exists, it's also what doesn't. A missing set of letters can do as much damage as a forged one, because absence invites interpretation, and interpretation invites someone else to become the author. When the archive is thin, the loudest storyteller wins. Now consider what private meant after 1945. For the public, private sounded gentle. It sounded personal. It sounded harmless. For people who needed protection, private was something else, a shield they could hold up between themselves and accountability. Because accountability requires clarity, and clarity requires records. So what happens when the record is fragmentary? The moral edges soften. And once they soften, a system can reintroduce itself. Not as evil, but as complicated. That is one of the most effective escapes, turning guilt into fog. Now here's the uncomfortable part. Scarcity is not always an accident. War destroys. Bombing destroys. Chaos destroys. But people also destroy. People hide. People burn. People remove names from the future. And even when no one burns a paper, the selection still happens. Through what families keep, what collectors prize, what officials seize, what museums can verify, and what publishers can sell. History is not only written by the victors, it's preserved by the survivors. And survivors are not neutral. A letter feels intimate because it is small, because it is direct, because it is addressed to someone. It can sound like truth. But a letter can also be an act of performance, especially when the writer knows the room they are writing from. Because the room teaches you something, certain words are safe, certain words endanger belonging, certain words endanger survival. So the letter becomes a controlled surface, not necessarily a lie, a controlled surface. And a controlled surface can still carry real emotion while hiding moral reality. That's why these letters are dangerous as proof. Not because they prove guilt, not because they prove innocence, because they allow the viewer to confuse intimacy with absolution. The viewer thinks, if she wrote about flowers and weather, she must have been distant from the machine. But the machine does not require you to write its name. The machine only requires you not to interrupt it. Now look again at the absence. When you read a private letter from a comfortable room and you don't see the victims, you're not only seeing what she did or didn't know. You're seeing what the room considered unspeakable. You're seeing what the inner circle refused to make ordinary language. Because once something becomes ordinary language, it becomes ordinary responsibility. So silence protects. It protects the leader's image. It protects the circle's comfort. It protects the storyteller's future self. And in the long run, it protects the public from clarity, because clarity is painful. Now bring in the private films. A camera at the Berghof is not a neutral object. A camera selects, a camera frames, a camera preserves. It preserves laughter. It preserves leisure. It preserves a world that appears separate from the war. And that preservation does something powerful. It creates a competing memory. A soft memory doesn't deny the crimes. It competes with them. This is why Private Hitler imagery mattered so much. It did not say he wasn't responsible. It whispered something more subtle. He was human. And once you accept that sentence, the next sentence arrives. Then the story is complicated. Complicated becomes a place to rest, a place to stop thinking, a place where responsibility can be redistributed until it disappears. This is why the private record is not merely interesting. It is consequential, because it shapes the emotional entry point into the story, and emotion determines what the viewer is willing to believe. After the war, artifacts moved. Some were seized, some were hidden, some were traded, some were sold, some were displayed. And that movement matters, because an artifact is not only evidence, it is also a narrative object. A letter in a museum is framed as history. A letter in an auction is framed as rarity. A letter in a book is framed as insight. A letter in a documentary is framed as intimacy. The same paper can mean four different things depending on who holds it, and that's where the next distortion begins. If the public primarily encounters these fragments through human interest, then human interest becomes the lens through which responsibility is understood. Not through structure, not through policy, not through victims, through romance, through private life, through what she was like. And that is exactly how systems protect themselves after they collapse. They pull the camera away from the machinery and move it toward the face. Silence was part of the decision. And silence doesn't end when people die. Silence can be inherited. There is a specific myth that often survives after catastrophic regimes fall. It's the myth of the harmless woman, a girlfriend, a secretary, a hostess, a companion, not a decision maker, not responsible, not political. And the myth is powerful because it contains a familiar story the public wants to believe. Because if evil can be neatly separated into the men, then everyone else becomes a spectator. But the inner circle was not a theater. It was a system. And systems require participation from many roles, not only the loud ones. The myth works because it sounds humane. It says she loved. She lived privately. She didn't understand. The public hears that and feels relief. Relief is dangerous in moral history because relief creates a space where responsibility can shrink. If you want to protect a system after the fact, give the public emotional relief. Now, to be precise, this is not a claim that Eva Braun directed policy. It's a claim about environment and alignment, about what it meant to remain close, to remain comfortable, to remain loyal, even as the world outside burned. And loyalty in a system like this is not a private emotion. It is a political behavior. After 1945, not knowing became more than a personal claim. It became a narrative pattern. It appeared in interrogations, in memoirs, in interviews, in casual retellings. Not always as a lie, often as a boundary. I knew enough to stay close, but not enough to be accountable. That is one of the most survivable positions a human being can claim after a regime collapses. And it spreads because it is socially contagious. If one person claims ignorance, others nearby benefit from the same fog. And then the public receives a whole chorus of voices repeating the same theme. I didn't know. It wasn't my role. I was only private. The repetition itself becomes persuasive, even when the structure says otherwise. One of the most unsettling features of inner circle records, diaries, notes, schedules, is how ordinary they can sound. Small complaints, meals, visits, weather. That ordinariness is not proof of innocence. It is proof of normalization. Systems survive by making themselves feel normal to the people inside them. And the moment something becomes normal, the conscience stops screaming. It becomes background noise. This is why the private letter matters so much. It's not because it contains secrets. It's because it reveals what the room considered safe to write and what it considered too dangerous to name. Late April 1945 is often described as tragic romance, two people staying together at the end. But that frame can hide something more structural. The paperwork, the formalization, the attempt to define legacy. A marriage certificate is not only a personal gesture, it is a record designed for history. It's a line placed into the future. In the final hours, the regime still cared about narrative, because narrative was always part of its power. A system collapses, and even then, it tries to arrange what the world will remember. That is not romance. That is control. Silence was part of the decision. And once you see it, you start noticing the same pattern elsewhere. Whenever a system faces collapse, it creates a private shelter. Then after collapse, it calls that shelter innocence. Now we return to the core question. If silence was part of the decision, who benefited from it and who paid? The answer is not abstract. It moves in predictable directions: upward, protection; downward, cost. That's how systems survive. They push the price onto people who cannot refuse it. First, the leader's image. A private human frame protects the public persona, even after the fall. Second, the inner circle. Silence allows proximity without explicit confession. It allows "I was there" without "I was responsible." Third, the post-war storyteller. Silence becomes a gift to the future self, because the future self will need a story that can live in daylight. Silence is not only about fear in the moment, it's about survivability afterward. The victims, not only physically, but in narrative. When you center private romance, the victims become background. When you fixate on what she was like, you reduce the war to atmosphere. And that reduction has consequences. It affects what the public remembers, what the public emphasizes, what the public excuses. The dead can be killed twice, once by violence and again by being turned into a footnote. The historical record pays too, because a thin archive doesn't only create gaps, it creates distortions. And distortions become the structure that future generations inherit. There's a lie hidden inside many post-war explanations. The lie is the idea that a private compartment can exist untouched inside a system built on total control. That private life is separate, but if the system controls the press, the image, the rooms, the access, the loyalty, then private life is not separate. Private life is one of the system's tools, because the private compartment is where the system rehearses being normal. And normal is how it recruits people who would never join evil openly. Now we name the method clearly. The system maintains itself by keeping morality out of the room. If morality enters, someone becomes responsible. If responsibility enters, comfort collapses. If comfort collapses, loyalty becomes unstable. So the room stays quiet, the room stays domestic, the room stays private. And once the room stays private long enough, the people inside forget that privacy can be a weapon. They begin to believe their own frame. Here is the final trap for the viewer. Intimacy feels like truth. A private letter feels honest because it is not a speech. A home movie feels honest because it is not propaganda music. A photograph feels honest because it looks spontaneous. But honesty is not determined by format. Honesty is determined by what the format allows you to avoid. A private format can hide the biggest truth, the cost, because the cost is outside the room. Always outside the room. Silence was part of the decision. And if we end the story there, we miss the final movement of silence, the one that happens long after the bunker. After 1945, the world wanted a clear moral story: trials and sentences, executions and confessions. But the private record offered something else: ambiguity. And ambiguity is comfortable, because it allows people to feel informed without being implicated. Ambiguity is the cheapest kind of knowledge. It costs the viewer nothing. So the story of Eva Braun could become a safe fascination, a private woman, a tragic romance, a final devotion. Safe fascination is a problem because it can detach the mind from consequence. It turns the war into aesthetic. It turns atrocity into background. And then the public starts asking the wrong questions. What was she like? What did she wear? Did she love him? Was she happy? Those questions are not immoral, but they are incomplete, because the deeper question is structural. What did her presence allow the room to feel? And what did that feeling allow the system to continue doing? Because systems don't only survive through orders, they survive through atmospheres. Atmospheres of normality, atmospheres of silence, atmospheres where the cost is out of frame. That is why the letters matter. Not because they contain shocking secrets, but because they show a disciplined absence. And disciplined absence is the signature of controlled environments. So when you hear the phrase private story, don't treat it as a separate world. Treat it as a mechanism. Ask what it protected. Ask what it trained people not to say. Ask who benefited from the quiet. And then ask the question history rarely asks loudly enough. How many crimes survive, not because people celebrate them, but because people keep them out of the room? Because the most durable form of complicity is the kind that looks like normal life. Silence was part of the decision. And once you recognize that, you stop reading the letters as romance. You start reading them as architecture. If this story left you with a question, keep it. And now, before we close, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. The United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, or anywhere else. And if someone in your family served, tell us. We read every story.